The next thing we're going to build is going to use a lot of DATs. And like we said before, DATs are the data operators. So we can create tables, text. This is how you would probably work with a lot of web APIs and Python. Now for this example, what we're going to do is make a little slider controlled preset system so that we can drive a text tops text as well as the kind of text styles of it dynamically. So with that said, let's get started here. I'm going to delete everything. And the first thing I'm going to do is make my text top. So I'll open the op create dialog, type in text, grab my text top, and then I'm going to want to dynamically drive the text that's inside this text top. So the way I can do that is first I'll make a text dat. And a text dat is really, you can think of it almost like a little WordPad or a little Microsoft Word without any of the features in it. But essentially what you can do is activate the viewer and you can start typing inside of this text dat. And it's basically just going to save that text in there. You can manipulate it later with more dats. You can reference it for different things. And that's what we're going to do here. We're going to use a text dat as our kind of text storage for our text top. So like always, like I said before we start referencing any kind of data between operators, it's always important to put a null. So I'm going to put a null dat here. And then I'm going to go to my text top. I'm going to delete the text derivative here. And then there's a parameter called dat. And essentially what this does is you can reference a dat in here, whether it's a table or a text dat, and then you can select text out of it to basically render in there instead of having to manually type the text inside this parameter. So in this case, what I can do for this dat parameter is just drag and drop my null right onto that parameter. And you'll see that we can see can start type, but it looks clipped on both sides. So another really useful feature of the text top is on the first page, we have word wrap, which will automatically kind of figure out when those breakpoints are and wrap the text so that you're not kind of getting text clipped. It's very useful because it's dynamic. So for instance, if I go back to my text, activate the viewer, type something else, and then I click outside of my text, you'll see that it tries to word wrap as best it can. Now, what's happening is it's wrapping the words, on the left and right plane, so it's not getting clipped, but the text is still so large that it kind of overflows on the top and bottom. So for this, another really handy feature of the text top is under the font parameters to go to auto size font. And there's a couple options. You can say auto fit if too large, auto fit always, whatever you like. For this one, we'll go with auto fit always. That way the text will also dynamically resize. So not only is it getting word wrapped on the left and right edges, but it's getting resized in case it becomes too big. Now with auto fit always, the nice thing is if we only have a little bit of text, so let me delete most of this. It'll also scale it upwards to kind of fill that space appropriately. So those are a couple of nice things about the text top. And what we're going to do is right now, if we middle click on our text top, we'll see it's 256 by 256. Personally, that's a little bit small for me. So I'm going to go to the common page and I'm going to update the resolution to be maybe 720 by 720. And I'm doing that because essentially what we're going to do is we're going to composite this text onto another video. My video is 720. So I want a nice square with my text in the middle of that video. So with that said, what we can do now is make another text, because let's say we have a few different preset texts pieces that we want to change between. So I'll copy and paste my text a few times. And I'll add different text inside of each one. Now what we're going to do is we need a way to switch between these different text dats and have them go into this null, which then gets referenced by our text top here. So luckily we have a really useful dat we can use called switch dat. So I'll open up the op create dialog, switch, and what we'll do is we'll have to plug all of these text dats into the switch, and then we can use this nice little index to basically switch between them. Now, one useful trick is, normally what you'd have to do is you'd go plug them all in one by one, and you'll notice that this switch dat, similar to the composite top that we had earlier, has a multi-input, so you can just keep hooking things up to it one by one. But there's a nice trick that you can do where if you right-click and drag and select all the operators that you want to connect, all you have to do is connect the first one, and all of them will get automatically connected. So now that we have them all connected, we can just look inside of this switch dats kind of viewer. And as I change that index, so you can see 1 gives me the second one, because remember, everything in TouchDesigner starts at an index of 0. I can go to 2, which will give me the third input. And then I can go to 3, which will finally give me that fourth input. So now if I plug this into my null here, we'll see that as I change the index, the text getting rendered in my text dat is updating. Now, if we go beyond our index number 3, 3, 7, 10, doesn't really matter. It doesn't change because there are no more inputs connected to that switch dat. So I'm going to grab all of these and just move them over a bit, because now that we've got our text set up, we can work on some of the formatting. So the things we're going to be changing about this text are under the color page parameters. And what we'll do is we'll switch up the text color as well as the alpha so that we have a couple of different looks when it's getting composited. So very similarly to how we set up our text dats here, going into a switch dat, going into a null, we're going to set up a similar system but with tables. And this can be thought of as like a really simple preset system. It's not the most efficient one, but if you're a beginner and you're just trying to save a few different states for, something like a text dat or maybe movie files, this is not a bad system to use. So the way to get started is first we're going to make a table dat. And a table dat functions similarly to a text dat, except you can add more rows and columns, and each cell is essentially the equivalent of a text dat, but inside of a cell. So let's say we wanted to have, we see here font color, we have RGB channels and an alpha. So I want to basically save 4 values in here. So first thing I'm going to do is activate the viewer so I can interact with the data inside. What I can do is either right click on the empty space of this table dat, or I can go and click on the kind of row number here, which is 0. I can right click on it and you'll see I have a bunch of options. I can hit add below, which will add a new row. Now you see I have 2 rows in 1 column. Like I said, I need 4 values, so I'm just going to keep adding rows here. So now that I have 4 rows, I also want to add another column, so that way I can actually keep this clean. I want to have, I don't want just a table with random numbers in it that, I'm not going to be able to identify later. I want to have a nice little header column and then having a column with just my values. So similarly to how we right-clicked on the row numbers itself to add a row below, what I can do is go to the columns, right-click on this column 0, and then hit add after, which will then add me another column. So now what I can do is I can just click inside of a cell, and you'll see that I have a cursor blinking here, and I can start typing. So I'll say color red. I'll drop down to the next row and say color green. Next, color blue. And you can even navigate this table with your keyboard arrows, so that I can come down here and type opacity. And then let's say my first preset is actually just going to be white text, which is going to be 111 for the RGB, and full opacity. Now what I can do is I'll turn off the viewer just so that I can actually control the operator in my network again. I'll copy and paste it 4 times for our 4 presets. This way each one of our text objects here will have a preset of its own. And then I'll go through and just edit that style a little bit. So maybe our second preset is going to be red text. So I'm going to 0 out the G and the B. Maybe I'll leave the opacity full here. For my third preset, maybe I'll do something like 0.5 for green, 0.7 for blue, and we'll keep the opacity full. And then finally, for my last one, what I'll do is maybe something more subtle. So maybe 0.3 on the R, 0.3 on the G, 0.3 on the blue. So that way it essentially becomes a bit of a dark gray. And then I'll actually set the opacity also down to 0.3 so that it kind of fades into the background. Now with all my values edited, I can kind of just turn off the viewer active state on these tables. And then similarly to like we did with our text going into a switch, we'll do the same thing with our tables. We'll set up a switch dat. I'll right click and drag around all my tables, connect the first one, and automatically they all get connected. So now the same principle that we used with the switch dat applies to tables as well, which is really helpful because we can see with an index of 0, we essentially get the contents of the first table. If I set an index of 1, it switches to the contents of the second table. 2 gives me the third table, and so on and so forth. So now we have a really easy way of kind of just managing, switching between all these things. What I'm going to do is I want to kind of line up the presets with the text. So I'm actually going to make a little controller that'll control these indices. And what I'm going to do is use some of the things that we used in our comp section. So the first thing I'll do is just make a little slider. And then I'm going to want this slider value. Well, let's take a look at the slider value first. Let's assume we don't know what's going on. So I'll make a null chop. And we can see the value of the slider is from 0 to 1. But like we saw with our switch, we actually want it to be from 0 to 3. So we know how to rearrange values at this point. We can insert a nice little math chop here. And I'll go to the range page. I know the from range is correct because my slider does in fact go from 0 to 1. And then I want the range to be from 0 to 3. Now, the only other thing I would want to do with this, just for my own sanity, is what you'll see is that my value coming from the slider is actually a float. So a float is basically just a number with decimals in it. This is different than an integer, which is just a whole number. Floats, like 1.848. That's not going to be useful for our switch because the switch stats don't actually interpolate. You can see it just kind of hard cuts between the different indices that are plugged in. So what we can do is maybe we should round our number here as well so that it's not sending decimals. So it's sending a whole number, an integer that will accurately map to each one of these indices. So also, surprise, surprise, our best friend math chop can also round for us. So we can insert another math chop after our math chop that does the scaling. And then on the first page, we have a nice little parameter called integer. We can click on it and you can see we have a few different options here. We can do a ceiling type of rounding, a floor, or just a general rounding. For this case, a general rounding is fine. Now you can see as my kind of more gradient float value changes, coming out of the output, I actually have a rounded integer. So now, like we did with everything else before we've done, if we want to control the parameter of this switch dat's index, I just select the switch dat so I see its parameters. I activate the viewer on my chop, drag and drop that channel right onto the value, and I choose relative chop reference. Now I'm going to do the same thing for the switch that I have down here. So first I'll select it, and then I can just drag and drop that value again onto the index and choose my second option. So now you can see as I'm moving through this slider, my text is changing. We haven't hooked up our style yet for the color and opacity, so we'll see that happen soon. But we're going to add one little trick step in between our switch here and our text. Now, when we switch kind of rapidly the actual contents of the text, that's because there's no real easy way for TouchDesigner to kind of blend text together. The best we can do at this point is just hard switch them. But we can blend values really easily. Now, we can't do that in DATs because DATs are really focused on string type of data, Python, that kind of stuff. But what we can do is actually convert this data from the DAT family back into channels, and then we can use some of the techniques we used with our chop networks where, we were using lag chops, filter chops, things that smooth the transition between two values. So that's actually relatively easy to do in Touch. So what we're going to do first, as always, before I make any big jumps, I'm going to set a little checkpoint for myself here with a null dat. That way, in case I ever need to insert anything between my switch and the area which I'm converting the values to chops, I'll have a nice place I can do that without having to change any other code. So with that said, now I'm ready to do my little data conversion. And what I can do is I can go to the chops and I can use one called a dat2 chop. And you know, you're probably starting to see a trend because in the last video we used another kind of conversion chop, but many of the families have specific chops or tops or operators that take the data from one family and convert them to the data type of another family. So for example, this dat to chop that we're going to use takes dat data and converts it to chop data. There's other ones. For example, there is a SOP to chop. So, you know, in the next section, we're going to be working with SOPs, but this would convert the data from a 3D model to just numeric data. You know, there's all kinds of different ones here. We can do chop to dat, so we can actually go in reverse. If we had some maybe chop data that we wanted to turn into a table, we could use this. There's other ones here like chop to top. So maybe if you had a bunch of numbers and you wanted to turn them into a texture that's similar to what we did in our top example when we were doing that cool like glitchy effect. So those are a lot of different things that you can explore later on, but just they're helpful to know that they exist. So in this case, because we have a dat and we want to convert into some channel data that we can then process with things like filters, what I'm going to do is make that dat to chop. In the dat parameter here, it wants to know the name of the dat that I basically want to convert. So what I can do is simply drag and drop my null here right onto the parameter. And by now, I'm hoping that you're seeing the pattern here where a lot of things are drag and drop. So don't be afraid if you don't know what's happening to just try dragging and dropping some things around and see if connections and references and things like that are made. So in this case, when we dragged null3 onto this dat parameter, we can see that little dotted line with an arrow got created. And like I was saying before, that's telling us that there's a reference happening. But unlike previously, it's not animated. And that's because this information isn't changing. So it's not dynamic. It referenced that data once and it's static now. Now that we have this table, you'll see that there's a bunch of parameters. Most of them you probably won't need to use at this point. And the way we've set up our table corresponds to basically exactly how the default settings of the dat2 are set up. So you can see now we have our first channel here, which is color_red. It doesn't like spaces, so it replaces them helpfully for us with underscores. We can see 0.3, color green 0.3, color blue 0.3, and opacity 0.3. Now if we go up to our slider and we change the values, you can see we have this dynamically changing chop value operator now. And you see color red is 0, color green is 0.5, blue is 0.7, opacity is 1. So that's great. So super quick and easy. We made a way to store a bunch of data, a way to switch between that data. And now that we've converted it back into chops, because it's all numeric data, what we can do is use some of those things like filters. So let's add a filter chop here. And then what I'm going to do is set the filter width to be maybe 3 seconds. And what this is going to do is it's going to interpolate over 3 seconds between the changing values. So now if I go from, you know, this slider where right now it's got index 2 to index 0, you can see we get these nice smooth transitions between those two presets. So that's awesome. I mean, that's basically, you know, in less than a few minutes, we rolled our own kind of simple preset system that you can use with kind of numeric data for parameters. So the last thing we really have to do here is just, as always, put a null chop because we're about to start referencing some data. I'm going into my text top here so I can grab the parameters under the color page. And once I have them visible, just like always, I can activate the viewer on my null chop and start dragging and dropping parameters to reference them. So I got my red, reference my green, reference my blue, and then finally reference my alpha/opacity. So now I'm actually going to set the little display flag on so I can see my text in the background. And now I can watch it do its kind of little state changes, text changes, color changes, opacity changes. And then the final thing we can do here is what I did was I made a movie file in top so I could have a nice dynamic background. I used that file plus button to open up my file chooser. I went into the nature folder where we have a few kind of 720p stock nature shots. Then I made an overtop, just like we did in our kind of first examples. And then I'm going to put the background as my movie, put my text into the first input on top of it. Just like we did before, prefit, I don't want it to be scaled, so I'm going to change fill to native resolution. And actually what I'll do is turn off the display flag on my text, put a null top at the end of this chain, and actually put the display flag on that on. So now we can see, as my values are changing and the presets are changing, we can see them live on that background. Now you can edit this to make this however you want. Maybe you don't want to change the text here, so we can maybe bypass our switch dat, only have one text, that way we're just changing styles. You can change things like the amount of time it takes for that transition. Right now it's 3 whole seconds, which maybe is too long for you. Maybe you can set it to 0.5 seconds. So now when I change it, it'll be much faster. And the sky's the limit here. I mean, we're just using it with a simple text. You can have multiple texts. You can have more advanced compositing, whatever you like. And we only did it with some styles, but you could do it with, all the parameters you wanted. There's really no limit on how much data you can store in a table. So with that said, that should give you a good introduction to DATs. And what I hope you're starting to see is that how using little pieces of functionality from each family, we're starting to add the complexity of our networks up. We have a little bit of tops here that are doing some compositing and rendering of 2D objects. We have, a handful of DATs here holding some data. Then they get converted into chops. We know how chops, we can use them to kind of smooth out values. We have another set of DATs here. We made a little controller for our presets here using some comps and some chops. So as we get through more and more, and as you kind of explore TouchDesigner more and more, that's really going to be a big thing. You're going to always want to try and take your idea and think about how the simplest blocks that could make that idea would look like. If you think, oh, I have particles flying around and they're doing all kinds of crazy stuff, you really want to drill down and say, okay, well, how are the particles doing their thing? What color are they? Where did they come from? What's the emitter? Is there an attractor? You always want to break things down into the smallest possible, little idea bricks, because that'll make it easier for you when you're trying to build these networks. Because then what you're going to do is just use a lot of the small little tools, a lot of little operators all chained together doing little things, and you'll end up with a cool app. So with that said, let's move on to our next operator family.